Good evening. Can you hear me? Everyone okay? All right, I'm Mike Ehrman, Chairman of the Historical Society. Welcome. There are new faces as well as old, and we very much welcome you here. We want to get to the speaker quickly, but I have a few things to mention before we do. The first is some very good news for us and for you. Number one, we have done since '06, we've done 77 programs. 68 of those are now not only on YouTube, but can be reached through our website. It's easier to do it that way. If you go in there and look for SHS on YouTube, you will find them there. And so we have almost 80 hours now of our programming there. And we'll continue to add to it, of course, as we go along. The second thing, and those of you who weren't here last time, Glickman, who's manning the film, and Patty Hughes in the back are responsible for bringing all of that to us. In the meantime, if you go to the library, anyone seen our new exhibit at the library yet? Yeah. I hope you like it. We bought the display board thanks to contributions to us, and Helen Wilson, our vice chairman in the back, and Betty Conley, I don't see her yet, have put that together. There she is. Hi, Betty. She slipped in on me. And it's really great to have that there, and we will be having rotating exhibits there. I think they've already talked about the next 3, 4, or 5 that we're going to have. So I call that our little mini museum. So please enjoy that. We have a long list of programs ahead of us already. I'm not going to talk about most of them because you have a sheet on your chair. You can see them. Zelda Curtis, who's here, will be our speaker in January on 9 Mile Run. Our February speaker is going to be on the Presbyterians of Western Pennsylvania, Mr. Gilmore. The rest you can see there. The other thing on your chair, of course, is a membership form. It's that time of year that groups look for new members. And in the past, we've always wanted members, but we also were what I like to call the nonprofit group, unofficially nonprofit group in the community that probably the only one that was in the black. Because we not only got dues, but we put out a book on Squirrel Hill that gave us royalties for a number of years. And so we weren't really spending a lot of money. With the new outreach program, and with getting incorporated, which we're going to begin the process of tomorrow, and all that comes with that, and eventually getting official tax-exempt status, which will make some of you maybe be more interested in giving money than you are now. This is a more expensive group to run than it used to be. And I urge all of you to become members, if you would. It's only, you can give more, but it's only $10 for an individual. The forms are easy to fill out. And I'd like to see a substantial growth in the number of members of this group for next year. I'm going to introduce Joel in a minute. Helen, do you have anything you needed to announce tonight? Okay, we're free and clear of that. Professor Joel Tarr from the Caliguiri University Professor of Urban History and History, Urban Environmental Policy at CMU. Professor Tarr has been here before to talk about horses. Tonight, he's going to talk about a very different topic. We're very excited to have him come back and to prepare an original piece for us. And I think without further ado, why don't you come on up?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Second time I've been here. Last time I did speak about horses. I wrote a book on horses in the city a few years ago with a colleague. And but this is a topic. The topic of natural gas is something that has occupied my mind either in front of it or the back of it for many years. And the reason I say that is, can you all hear me, by the way? Yeah. If I put this down, is that good? Is it still making me? You still here? No. All right. So I'm sorry? No, not yet, please. I'll explain why. I need the light on the podium. That's okay. So, some years ago, some of you may know that I did work on smoke control in Pittsburgh. And I wrote on that in the early 1980s. And when I did that, I recounted the importance of natural gas to Pittsburgh, particularly in terms of clearing up the air. And over the years, I began to gather material on natural gas and its development. And then I put it aside for a while. And then when the fracking boom began, approximately 10 years ago, the boom actually began about 6 or 7 years ago, I became reacquainted with the topic of natural gas, and I realized I'd already collected a fair amount of material about it. So what I've done in the last several years is write a few pieces. I've had a few pieces in the Post-Gazette that you may have seen about natural gas in western Pennsylvania and some of the issues there and some of the problems. And I'm continuing to do work on this topic. Is a book going to evolve out of it? I probably don't think so. I'm not sure, but I'll have a series of articles. So you know, we are so preoccupied today in this city and in this region with the issue of natural gas. And of course, this is really the latest at a stage of very rich elements in terms of energy history that have characterized the western Pennsylvania region. Now, if you just look at oil and gas, it's estimated that probably at least 400,000 wells have been sunk in the last 150 years approximately in the state, beginning with Titusville in 1859. Do we know where all these wells were? No, we know where less than half of them were. Do we know what they're doing? Whether they're spewing out methane or they're spewing out perhaps droplets of oil? We don't know, really. And that's because it's not easy to find them. I actually found a publication from the U.S. Bureau of Mines from 1984 entitled How to Find Lost Gas and Oil Wells. And it said the best way to find them is to walk in the woods. So much for advanced technology. Of course, that's 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, but still, that still may be one of the best ways to find it, although certainly, supposedly, new techniques are being developed to help us find old, orphan wells, as they are called. Now, I'm going to do this talk in a kind of old-fashioned way. I do have some images, and I have a PowerPoint, but I'm going to primarily talk from my text, my notes, and then occasionally I'll jump down to my computer to show you some images. And don't hesitate to ask me any questions as I go along. A lot of my information actually comes from the Pennsylvania Geological Survey volumes. They did some terrific stuff in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. And I think that they're often neglected. I do know that today the Geological Survey people do feel neglected by the Oil and Gas Division, the Department of the DER, Department of Resources, and Department of Environmental Protection. But anyway, we know, of course, that within the last 10 years, we've gone through a boom in natural gas production. Why has this been happening? It's been happening because of a rise in gas prices over time, and the application of a new technology that's called hydrofracking, or horizontal drilling, to the Marcellus Shale deposit that extends throughout the state. And below that, many places, is the Utica Shale, and there are other shales beneath that. So we may be in for many, many years of digging in the shale to bring out both gas and oil. And thousands of fracking wells have been sunk throughout Pennsylvania, and thousands more have been projected. I'd say approximately 10,000 probably have been dug. There's some that have been dug that aren't necessarily producing, have not been connected to pipelines yet, but there's an awful lot out there. And there are extensive discussions, as you know, that are taking place throughout the state on issues such as regulatory policy, taxation. We're going to get an extraction tax with the new governor, the extent of the drilling, The duration of the supply, how long is it going to last? And then also, of course, what are the environmental impacts of all this that's going on? Now, this, however, this boom, this natural gas boom, is not unique to the region or to the state. It really mirrors in many ways a boom that began in the late 19th century and extended for more than a decade. And some of the earliest developments of natural gas, thinking of wells, actually occurred in the eastern neighborhoods of the city, North Point Breeze, Homestead, Squirrel Hill, as well as in Murraysville area further to the east where there was a major natural gas field. Just let me give you a couple of slides here. I don't trip on the way. Sorry? No, you can't. I have to do it. You don't have to. Thank you. Well, it doesn't work.
Try the space bar.
I'm sorry?
Space bar. Try the space bar.
Okay. All right. Is that the first one that came out? Okay, no, we're going to do one. Let's go back. No, it's going forward. Forward, backward. Okay. Here we are. This is a map that shows you, where's my, it shows you, it's a rough map. I was in the process of trying to get some help in drawing a more precise map, GIS map, but unfortunately I didn't get around to it. But I do have this map, and this map shows you, this is really from an 1922 publication of the Geological Survey. It shows you the major locations of gas, can't do that either, in the region. We have Pittsburgh, of course, Allegheny County, North Point Breeze, Murraysville, McKeesport, and these were, in terms of early development, among the most important. I'm not saying there weren't other wells and other places in the region and the state there were, but they were among the most important. Now, what I'm looking at is what we call conventional natural gas drilling. And the conventional natural gas well, you can see it's very clear there, isn't it? You sink drill a hole, you sink a casing down, you begin to extract the gas from a particular pool of gas that exists. And it's very different in many ways than what happens when you begin to develop fracking wells. A fracking well, of course, is a horizontal well. You, of course, you have to sink a vertical well first, but then you go off in different directions. And one of the things about a fracking well is that you can go off in an awful lot of different directions, like a Christmas tree. So just because it's one well pad doesn't mean that they're only extracting from one particular point. It goes out in all kinds of directions. These can go out as far as a mile in a horizontal direction. Now this slide is an old slide in the sense that it only goes up to 2008. But you can see the huge difference in terms of the production of gas in the state once we begin to frack. You get fracking right about here, right about in here, and suddenly it soars. And if I was to find a make a more recent slide, is that this curve will be way off the chart. There's no doubt about it. So there's far more gas being produced by fracking wells than are produced or were produced by the conventional natural gas wells. Although there are still about 50,000 conventional natural gas wells in the state. Now, we often tend to forget, however, that the first gas to come into Pittsburgh was not natural gas. It was really manufactured gas made from coal. And in 1837, the first manufactured gas plant was set up. And eventually, by the late 19th century, there were 5 manufactured gas companies existing in the city. All of them later on went out of business or were absorbed by EQT, or the Philadelphia company, Westinghouse. But it's interesting that the East End, including parts of Squirrel Hill, Highland Park, and so on, was served by the by the East End Gas Company. East End Gas Company. How many of you knew that there was an East End Gas Company? Anybody know where? Anybody here know? It was hard to find its exact location, but I finally did. It was down on Washington Boulevard, down towards Caliguiri Boulevard there. And what is it now? If you go down to that site, there's some kind of garage and things like that. So what's particularly interesting to me is, did they clean the site of toxic materials before they put down concrete on top of it? I'm a little skeptical about that. But as I said, there are 5 manufactured gas plants in the city. And some of them had very dramatic kinds of consequences because it had been forgotten about that they were there. And perhaps the largest one that created a problem in that regard was the Pittsburgh Gas Works, which was located where the high-tech park is now on the Monongahela River. And before that, of course, that site had been occupied by Jones and Lockton Steel. So when they built the tech park, it was after they had demolished the Jones and Lockton buildings and the blast furnace service and so on. And they didn't remember, nobody remembered that there had been a manufactured gas plant there. And they began to find material, arsenic and things like that in the soil that didn't have any relationship to the steel plant. And what happened was that the DEP put a halt to building on that site until they could identify where it came from. And that's when a bunch of us at CMU were able to show, using early maps, that there had been this big manufactured gas plant there until about 1900. Yeah.
Why is it called manufactured gas?
Because basically what you're doing is taking coal and subjecting it to heat. It's actually a byproduct coke plant, in a way. It's very similar. It's made from coal. It doesn't have to be made from coal. It could be made from organic materials. But bituminous coal is the best material, best source of coal gas, as it was called. And it was used throughout the United States, but particularly in the East. Eventually, petroleum took over in some of the West Coast plants, although the East stayed dependent mostly on bituminous coal. Now, natural gas. Now, the first discovery of natural gas was made by drillers seeking oil and salt in the northwestern quarter of Pennsylvania. And they hit natural gas in the 1860s. They weren't sure what to do with it. And they occasionally used it to heat boilers and to power drilling equipment. Oftentimes they flared it. They wasted it. There were no uses for it. They didn't know what to do with it, where the uses were, and they didn't have the pipeline systems to get it to users. And in the mid and late 1870s, drillers found substantial gas supplies in some neighboring counties, Butler, Armstrong, and Clarion counties. And these are close to industrial consumers, or potential industrial consumers, and particularly to 2 iron manufacturers north of Pittsburgh, Sprang, Califont and Company in Etna, and Graff, Bennett and Company in Millvale. And they pioneered, these 2 companies, in bringing natural gas into their works and as a substitute for coal. It's interesting to reading about the development of this pipeline, that they had a lot of problems with taking the pipeline through the farms. A number of farmers that were reluctant to let the pipeline go through their land. They didn't know what it was going to do. They were concerned, and so on and so on. But at any rate, this becomes a very important use of natural gas to supply heat. And other mills, of course, are going to see the success of these 2 and are going to follow in their regard. When did Carnegie, for instance, start to use natural gas in his works? In 1883, for instance. A number of other industrial users in the city also used it. And some, by the way, like Jones and Lockton Steel and Carnegie, sank or tried to sink wells on their own property to get natural gas. Now, actually, they've been drilling in the city of Pittsburgh as early as 1875. It was a well that was known as Boyd's Hill, a well on Boyd's Hill, and located in the north, near the north end of what is today the Birmingham Bridge. And this well produced a little gas, and it was soon flooded out. And because of the relationship between the strata here and the saltwater deposits, a number of wells that were drilled in this region were flooded out by salt water. And the salt water would spew out in thousands and thousands of gallons, creating, obviously, not a very happy situation. Now, perhaps the largest major discovery made in the region now occurred in 1878 in the Murraysville region. And this is the discovery of the well that became known as the Haymaker well. Some of you may know about the controversy that existed about who owned that well and the armed conflict that took place between attempts to capture that well. Eventually it's taken over by People's Natural Gas. At that time was Pugh and Emerson, and who became People's Natural Gas later on. And the well produced a very large volume of gas. But for several years, it was just flared. And it was just flared because of the lack of a pipeline connection to consumers. Now, why did they have pipelines? Pipelines are very expensive. And entrepreneurs were initially reluctant to pipe it into untested markets because of the required investment in expensive and untried infrastructure. They were also very concerned about risk of explosions, and we're going to see that as a specific problem that does occur. And the danger also of piping gas under very high pressures into residential markets. So, by the way, I also should mention that the manufactured gas companies were not very happy about natural gas coming to the city and tried to block its entrance. Just let me show you a couple of slides now. I'll try to avoid slipping on the wire. Now, this is an etching that comes from Harper's Weekly that I found in 1886. And it gives you, can you make that out clearly? A sense of the energy and the power reflected in these gas fields. It's not only the Murraysville field that's shown, but it's also other locations around the area. And the magazines of the time, the 1880s, treated natural gas in Pittsburgh as a marvelous coming, as something that was, all the predictions that were made about it was never going to be exhausted. It was going to transform Pittsburgh into really one of the really great industrial cities in the world, which of course it did become, and natural gas was very, very important. But it's very interesting to see the predictions that are made about how long it's going to last, you see. It's never going to run out. Andrew Carnegie said it's never going to run out. And other people also said that. Well, of course, we know, gas does run out, and sure, just like we know the Marcellus shale gas is going to run out, and so along the line. When is the key question. If you go to Murraysville, you can find this particular sign about the Haymarket well. I don't know if you can read that, but it's a pioneer well. And this is another sign that exists out there. I know some people from Murraysville, none of them, the people I knew that there had been a natural gas field there. Not only talking about one or two wells, we're talking about a very major natural gas field with a number of different wells that developed out there.
Joel?
Yeah.
Is that where the storage field is now?
Zelda, I'm sorry?
Yeah, is that where the storage field is now in Murraysville?
What's the storage
There's
field?
a gas
for?
storage field out there.
I don't know. I really don't know the answer
Okay.
to that. Could be, as a matter of fact, it would make sense,
Yeah, that's,
to do it that way.
right.
All right, now, in 1883, a familiar Pittsburgh resident by the name of George Westinghouse, who already had made a lot of money with the air brake and other things like that, a real genius as an inventor. He sunk a well on his property. His estate was called Solitude. It was in North Point Breeze, and it's where, by the way, Mellon Park is today. And he sunk this well. Why? Because he wanted to try to retrieve commercial amounts of gas and sell it? No, he wanted to find some gas to heat his garden and his conservatory. And so he sunk this well in, and they hit a tremendous, highly pressurized pool of gas. And supposedly, a Pripyat weighing 3,000 pounds was blown out of the well, and it caught fire. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, people around Pittsburgh came to marvel at this huge plume, you see, of the burning well, burning gas from Westinghouse's well. And finally, it was put out, but it was clear that there was gas in Pittsburgh, and there was gas particularly in the location. Now, actually, before he struck that gas in 1883, there were two natural gas firms, one called the Fuel Gas Company, and the other one the Penn Fuel Company, which later on becomes Peoples, who were incorporated under a Pennsylvania Act, the Corporation Act in 1874. The details here are fairly important. And in 1884, the Fuel Gas Company began piping gas into Pittsburgh's south side from its Murraysville well. And in the same year, the Penn Fuel Company, which now owned the Haymaker, began distributing natural gas by pipeline to customers in East Liberty and in Lawrenceville. Well, these two companies went to war with each other, and the question was whether one of them had the exclusive right to market, to sell, and distribute natural gas in Pittsburgh. And what happened was that the dispute between the two companies went up to the courts, the Supreme Court, who said that neither of them had the right. And the reason why neither of them had the right was because there was no legislation that applied specifically to natural gas. They said that one of the companies had said, in fact, had been incorporated to produce manufactured gas, not natural gas. So that meant that in order to have natural gas come to the city, be consumed, sold to consumers, you had to have new legislation. And the result was going to be the Natural Gas Act of 1885. After a lot of debate, by the way, that takes place in the legislature, and I've gone through those records and so on. It's quite interesting, the different opinions that existed about the terms of the act. Now, if any of you know about Act 13 and the arguments that have gone on about natural gas legislation today, you see that all this replicated in this earlier period of time. So what happened is that the act permits the chartering of corporations, and I quote, for the purpose of producing, dealing in, transporting, storing, and supplying natural gas. It gave gas corporations a right of eminent domain for the laying of pipelines, and it contained, and this is very interesting to me, specific requirements regarding the sealing and plugging of abandoned wells. And if you didn't plug your well and you're caught not plugging it, there's a $200 fine if the regulations were not followed. Who enforced the law? I don't know. You see, that was the problem, because the act did not specify who should enforce the law, even though it did have a penalty. But why did they have this requirement, though? Primarily, I think, to avoid waste of natural gas and to prevent flooding, salt water coming up and flooding adjacent wells. So here Westinghouse sinks his well. It's successful, and he goes on to drill 7 more wells in Pittsburgh's Point Breeze and Homewood areas and neighborhoods. And he also acquires land in Murraysville, because it was clear that that was a major gas field. He also organized something called the Philadelphia Company under an old state charter to supply gas to Pittsburgh residences and industries and to outlying areas. And he was very aggressive about attracting residential and industrial customers. The Philadelphia Company, by the way, goes on to take over the manufactured gas plants, the streetcar systems in Pittsburgh, Duquesne Light, and other things like that. It's finally broken up in the 1930s by the Supreme Court. But the Philadelphia Company, which Westinghouse had formed, was really a mammoth kind, almost a monopoly on many, many services in the region. Okay, now, Westinghouse is an inventive genius, and he goes about inventing and patenting a number of technical improvements in the transport of natural gas. Also gas regulators and gas meters. And he acquires more and more land also for gas in Allegheny and Westmoreland counties. By the beginning of 1885, in addition to Westinghouse's Philadelphia company, 4 other companies have been created that were bringing gas into Pittsburgh, and they were funded by various Pittsburgh banking interests, the Mellon Bank, for instance, of course, and so on. And they were drilling wells throughout the city. Doesn't mean that everyone that came in was drilled was going to come in. There were many dry wells, but still, there were a lot. And in 1886, the Pennsylvania Geological Survey lists 18 active wells in Homewood, and in that, it said also that vicinity. That was Ward 21, before the wards were renumbered in 1907. And soon, there are derricks all over Pittsburgh, dotting the Pittsburgh landscape, and gas standpipes where excess gas would be lit. And there are many areas around the city that were lit up by the fact that you had this natural gas burning. But in addition to the gas burning and furnishing light, you also had a large number of explosions. And in 1884 and 1885, for instance, there were some very serious explosions that occurred in the city of Pittsburgh. Some of the worst were along Penn Avenue, 30th Street, 33rd Street, 34th Street. And you have to realize that natural gas is a new fuel. Natural gas appliances and pipelines were new technologies. They involved a very explosive and volatile substance. And there are a lot of technical questions that existed about what was the best material to use for a pipeline, the best material to use to seal it, and what was the safest gas pressure. Because the tendency in the beginning was just to use the pressure from the well to send the pipe, the gas through the pipe into the consumer. But in addition to that, city consumers were very inexperienced in gas use. They didn't know. For instance, there's different stories that you hear about somebody would have gas, they would smell gas in the house, so they would take a lantern and go down to the basement to see if they could find the leak or the smell. Where was the smell coming from? And there's a fair number of people were killed by these explosions. I have a file where I've collected all this newspaper stories about natural gas explosions. On February 2nd of 1885, for instance, the Pittsburgh Post ran an editorial entitled "Death in the Streets," and it warned that, save in a state of war, we don't believe any large city in the world was ever in a more perilous situation than Pittsburgh is today, owing to the dangers of natural gas explosions. Does it sound like some of the arguments that have been coming out about fracking? Perhaps. Now, Westinghouse, you remember, is a great inventor, a very smart man, and he emphasized the safety of his distribution system. And he said he had developed a technology to prevent leaks of gas under high pressure. And he had allies in the city council. He was able to persuade them to pass a general ordinance, they call the Westinghouse Ordinance, which required that if you're going to use gas in the city, you had to use a particular technique. Who had the patent on that technique? George Westinghouse. And he ran newspaper ads throughout 1885 and 1886, boasting that his Philadelphia company had, and I quote, "facilities equaled by no other company for the safe and economical use of this fuel." And he also said that they had possessed resources and reserves that would guarantee uninterrupted gas supply. Okay, now, unfortunately, there are continued gas explosions that occur, causing more injuries and deaths and property destruction. And there are protest meetings throughout the city over a demand that the city council take action. And so the city council appoints a natural gas commission, and it takes extensive testimony in 1885 from gas company personnel, city officials, and technicians to determine the cause of the explosions. It's very interesting to read the National Gas Commission report and some of the court decision reports then, because you get an eerie feeling, you know, the similarities of concerns from the past and the way they reflected today. Now, there was an important issue also. You okay? We have an explosive situation here. Don't light a match, please. So, in August of 1885, after the report of the commission, the Pittsburgh City Council goes on to pass a natural gas ordinance that said natural gas was it should be a public use, open to regulation, and passed an act also laying down specific standards for the laying and testing of pipe under the direction of the city engineer. And by the way, the city engineer at that time was Edward Bigelow, of course the father of Pittsburgh Parks. A number of the features of this ordinance again involved George Westinghouse's patented improvements in gas transmission, giving him an advantage over his competitors. The passage of this ordinance, however, brings the city of Pittsburgh into legal collision with the state. In June of 1885, the People's Natural Gas Company seeks to enter the city with a pipeline from its Murraysville field, carrying gas from the wells of Murraysville along this route, along the northern pike to Wilkinsburg, entering the city through 9 Mile Run, crossing part of Squirrel Hill and Greenfield, and extending onto 2nd Avenue above the mouth of 4 Mile Run. And the company had acquired rights for access for its pipelines from adjoining property owners. But it had not acquired the rights entirely in terms of crossing city streets. So there's some rights to run their pipeline, but in terms of the use of city streets to run their pipelines or to cross city streets, this ends up in dispute. Particularly one intersection at Salina and Greenfield Avenues is where there was a direct conflict between the city and the gas company. I tried to find Salina Avenue on early maps and so on. I cannot find it. It must have been, the name must have changed. It probably was Salt Works. There was a Salt Works station. There were a lot of Salt Works there, but I'm sure there is a street, so the Saline Street, of course. But I don't think it's the same street. But anyway, this is where this conflict occurred. And the city refused to give people's permission to lay pipe at the crossing. And it also refuses to give them an ordinance. And Ed Bigelow claimed in testimony that the company had not complied with the requirements of the city natural gas ordinance. But people said they had, and they sued. And charging that the city ordinance was in violation of the Natural Gas Act of 1885, passed on the state level. And in 1886, the case goes to the state Supreme Court, and they agree with Peoples. They agree that there were parts of the Pittsburgh ordinance that were invalid because they conflicted with the state act. So what happened is that here is an early case of preemption by the state of the rights of a locality to control things that are happening within its own territory. And of course, we have this recent thing with zoning that occurred, whether you could build new fracking wells on some sites. And the Supreme Court, in this case, went along with the localities, to the great unhappiness of the gas companies. Okay, so by 1886, at the end of it, there were 6 companies that got municipal charters and piping gas into the city for industrial and residential uses. And in addition, as I said before, there were a number of industries that had drilled on their own property. And in 1890, for instance, Brown's Directory of American Gas Companies listed 78 gas companies in the Pittsburgh region. The largest company, however, distributing gas in the city, no surprise, is George Westinghouse's Philadelphia Company. And it had also taken over in that time period 20 smaller companies, natural gas companies. So it had become a real mammoth supplier of natural gas. Peoples was next after. There were a couple of others that were fairly big, but Philadelphia was the biggest. And by 1888, it supplied 700 mills and factories, 25,000 homes with gas fuel. By 1886 also, about over 100 wells have been drilled in various places in Allegheny County, including the city. Now, one of the great benefits of this natural gas is the fact that Pittsburgh, which had been known as the Smoky City, now becomes known as an incredibly clean city. A city that had undergone a marvelous revival as the natural gas replaced coal particularly by mills as well as by residences. And national as well as local publications applauded the benefits of natural gas and the disappearance, and I quote, of the black pall-like cloud that had hung over the city. And so it's very similar to what's going on today, of course, isn't it, in terms of the competition with coal use. Natural gas supposedly is replacing coal, of course, particularly with electrical utilities. It supposedly is cleaning up the air, less particle pollution. Of course, there's a lot of issues about CO2 and so on, but still, and methane, but still it is a similar kind of context. Natural gas replaces coal, the environment becomes cleaner, and who knows, global climate change is delayed. Okay, now remember I said before that everybody said, not everybody, many people said, this is endless supply, it's always going to go on. Well, unfortunately, by 1890, a lot of the local supplies had run out. And a number of firms shifted, including Carnegie's firms, the Edgar Thompson Works, for instance, had shifted back to coal. Of course, it was not only the gas was running out, but it was also very episodic. It came, sometimes it hit into a well, then it began, then the well was exhausted, and the firms could not obviously operate in that kind of uncertain kind of climate. Now the industry also was marked, the natural gas industry, by tremendous waste and a lack of efficient uses. Also, prices were incredibly low at the time. They used a flat price, and if you wanted to use natural gas, you could get it at a very, very, very cheap rate. But industrial users particularly began to feel they could not live with the situation, the fluctuation in terms of supply, and as they said, went back to coal. And the depletion of natural gas supplies was something that the companies themselves were aware of, and some of them actually explored building manufactured gas plants, so to fill in so the natural gas would not be could be saved, something to be supplemented with the manufactured gas. Actually, one manufactured gas plant was built by EQT, Equitable, in the 1919 to 21 period. Well, that's a different story. Now, it's interesting that so the natural gas runs out, we go back to coal, and what do you think happens to the air? The air gets dirty, of course, again. And the return of the smoke is very important in terms of Pittsburgh reform. It's because it's in this period of time when people had experienced clean air, and then they went back into the smoke, that the demand came for some kind of regulation in terms of smoke pollution. And the key group in the beginning here was the Ladies' Home Protective Association of Allegheny County. So women are very critical in terms of cleaning up also the air, the water also, in Pittsburgh history. Now, by 1900, natural gas supplies have begun to increase again. Now, why did they increase? They increased because more wells were sunk, but particularly because they constructed pipelines that could bring in gas from West Virginia. So a large amount of natural gas is coming back, but it's much more expensive. Because the pipelines are expensive, of course, to build, and the price is higher. And there was not enough also to meet the a lot of growing industrial and residential demand at higher prices too. So what you do is you have a situation where the number of domestic gas users increases very considerably in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. The figure I have here is between 1897 and 1913, the number of domestic gas consumers in Pennsylvania increased from a little over 200,000 to over 400,000. And the number of industrial customers also increased. But the economy was growing so fast, you see, the gas supply could not keep up with it, the demands. Drilling in western Pennsylvania and throughout the state increases, but it's not fast enough to meet demand. And also many, many wells are now either being exhausted or other wells are coming in dry. And this whole thing comes to a head, really comes to a head, because of World War I. During World War I, there was a major fuel crisis involving not only natural gas, but also involving coal. And there are a number of national commissions that are set up to try to handle the fuel crisis. And it particularly, of course, resounded in this region. And so there is this foreboding that the circumstances of, in terms of depletion of gas and the future of the lack of energy supplies is particularly felt during the war and right after the war. And I want to, before I go to some specific sites, I want to mention the fact that in 1920, this Pennsylvania state geologist, George Ashley, issued a strong warning. He said, you better be aware of the fact that natural gas can be exhausted, it will be exhausted in the future. And unless you stop wasting it, unless you start being more efficient, unless new sources are found, we're going to have to abandon its use. And his implication was that unless these steps were taken, Pennsylvania's natural gas industry would follow the path of decline that had been followed by its petroleum industry a half century before that. You remember the great boom that we went through with petroleum, and then how much of it was decline and exhausted and so on along the line. So, okay. Now, I want to, before I conclude, I just want to talk about 3 local sites that are relatively close, 2 of them particularly relatively close to where we are today, but also one that's a little further away, but I think there are interesting lessons that come from it. The first local site is 9 Mile Run, which I mentioned already, okay? Aside from the drilling in Homewood, as I said, North Point Breeze also, drilling in 9 Mile Run. And as early as 1886, the Oil and Gas Report reports that a well, the so-called Cannon Well, had been drilled on the hill that was north of 9 Mile Run in the 22nd Ward. And that initially it had a very strong flow of gas. However, it diminished rapidly, which was a very common kind of thing to happen. So then that well is abandoned. We don't know what happened to it, by the way. And further drilling in 9 Mile Run occurs in 1894 and 1895, about a mile from the mouth of 9 Mile Run on the Monongahela River. And these wells, again, produce gas in the beginning, but they're soon drowned out by water. As I said, it was the problem with many of these wells. Then in 1920, another productive well is drilled in 9 Mile Run that produces between 1 million and 3 million cubic foot of gas a day. And that may be the last, next to the last productive well that existed in 9 Mile Run. But there was clearly a 9 Mile Run gas field, and I actually have some pretty murky photographs of it. Oh, this is a standpipe for flaring the gas in Pittsburgh. I mentioned flaring before. This will give you an idea. This is a gas pipeline that's being laid along Penn Avenue. And you can see the depth of it is not particularly deep. And there are many concerns about the quality of the metal used in the pipe. They used, in the beginning, they were using cast iron. They had problems with that. Then they used wrought iron, which they were more successful with. There were a lot of problems with the joints, however. So you can see, if you look at this line, you can say, well, maybe you understand why there are problems with explosions. This is a picture of a well that existed on the Jones and Lockland site. I told you they dug, and they were one of the few industrial firms that was successful in finding gas on their site. And this is a 9 Mile Run gas field. And this picture is probably from around 1920, I would say, right around before that. And can you make out the derricks in the background there? Here's another picture of the 9 Mile Run field. And this is a mystery gas well. I was going through pictures in the Historic Pittsburgh collection, which is a wonderful source. And I ran across this picture of a gas well just located off what becomes the Parkway East, just on the eastern side of the Squirrel Hill tunnels, which were being built at that time. So obviously, they were still drilling in some places in 9 Mile Run, and they were still producing gas. Does anybody know anything about this particular site? Zelda, do you know anything about it?
Isn't that Commercial Avenue that we see?
No.
You don't think so?
No, I think that is not Commercial Avenue. This is to the east of what would be the exit of the tunnel.
Okay, and so this is not near Union Switch and Signal?
It's before.
Okay, well, but that area,
Yeah, that's right.
okay.
Okay, now,
Oh, wow.
okay, so we have these two sites I mentioned that are pretty close to where we were. Oh no, I'm sorry, one second. Another site I want to mention here is the well that exists on the Carnegie Tech campus. Some of you may have read a piece I wrote about that. When Carnegie Tech is founded and begins to operate in 1905, it's entirely dependent on natural gas, supplied by People's Natural Gas. But by 1917, there was a national fuel crisis, as I said, and this impacts the school. And People's Natural Gas informs the school that it was raising rates and that it could not guarantee that adequate supplies existed to carry the school through the winter. So gas experts tell President Hammerschlag that a gas supply could be found beneath the campus at about between 3,500 to 3,800 feet, and that a well should be dug and it would flow for approximately 4 years. And they dug it. It began the end of 1917, and in 1918, June of 1918, it was completed at a depth of 2,300 feet, and it had an initial flow of 250,000 cubic feet of gas per day. Where was the well? That's a mystery. I have seen at least 6 to 8 different reports on that well in the trustees' minutes of Carnegie Tech. I read everything I could get my hands on. I looked at photographs. I never found out exactly where the well was. I'm pretty sure it was somewhere down in the dip behind Donna Hall. I don't know if you know about that. Before you get to the stadium, that is, it would be south of the stadium. I think it was probably in there. And you can say, well, why can't you go in there with a metal detector and find the casing? Because I know that they removed the casing. Because they talked a lot about if the well ran out, they could always remove the casing and they could sell it for scrap. And that's undoubtedly what they did. So what happened is that by 1920, the well begins to take on water, and further drilling down another 1,500 feet did not produce more gas. And Carnegie Tech goes back to coal in the early 1920s as its primary fuel until the 1970s. In the 1970s, it joins the Belfield boiler plant, which supplied fuel and heat and everything to the Carnegie Museum and so on. But it still is a user of coal. And finally, in 2009, Belfield finally shifted from coal to natural gas. So we'll go through the whole cycle. Carnegie Tech starts with natural gas, it ends with natural gas. All right, the last case I want to talk about is one I think is for which we have the best photographic evidence, but we don't have enough. This is the McKeesport gas boom. It's called the McKeesport gas boom, but it really took place in North Versailles and Versailles. There had been some drilling in that area between 1950 and 1919 with some kind of modest production. But in 1919 and 1920, a major producer, one of world scale production was done. And it was in what was called the Speechley Sand. And it was in North Versailles. And further exploration, as soon as that was done, they began to produce gas, took place in Versailles, Snake Hollow, East McKeesport, and this whole area became known as the McKeesport Pool. One well in this field, number 3, turned out to be an incredible producer, over 56 million cubic feet of gas in a single day. But there are other major producers too. And eventually, it's hard to tell exactly how many wells were dug, but at least 600 and as many as 1,000 wells were dug in a relatively small area of about 850 acres. I mean, imagine, and this is a picture, this is a wonderful picture of, you can see the sails across the yacht, and those are the derricks. Now, why are they so close to each other? What's going on there? because this 864-acre area had been subdivided for residential purposes before that. And so that all these landowners said, hey, I'm going to capture some of that gas before anybody else does. We have the law of capture, of course, in Pennsylvania. And they sunk all these wells. As the Pennsylvania Geological Survey people warned them at the beginning, you're going to exhaust this field a lot faster than it would be. And they later estimated that 4 major wells could have gotten the gas out of that field, but instead of 4 major wells, you had drilling in wells, you had hundreds and hundreds of them. A frenzy takes place in McKeesport. They were selling stock in gas companies, in barbershops, and in grocery stores. And hundreds of people invested their life savings in stock that turned out to be worthless. But production declines very rapidly, and many well bores were never plugged. There's no doubt about that. Or they were covered over by structures or filled by landowners. Now, some of you may know that in McKeesport area, in DeSales, they've had serious problems with methane leakage. And I don't mean 50 years ago, I mean more very recently, they've had these problems. And one of the reasons why these problems got worse, there were some problems in the 30s, but got worse in the more recent period, decades, is because during the Second World War, a number of people, scavengers, removed the casings, found the casings and removed the casings from the gas wells, the metal sleeves, to sell them for scrap. So what happened is that, according to a study that was done by the National Energy Technology Laboratory, methane began leaking into buildings from abandoned and improperly plugged well bores, creating air pollution and explosion hazards. Many homes had to vent their gas, especially the so-called hot spots in Snake Hollow. There was very extensive drilling. I'll have a picture of that. And efforts to reduce the leaking of the methane were made, but supposedly it's still going on. And you can still see vent pipes supposedly scattered throughout the community there. Let me show you a couple more pictures. $1, there you go. Investment. The life savings at $1 a share. You're obviously bound to become rich on natural gas. This is Snake Hollow in McKeesport. It was a very productive gas belt, okay? And very crowded with derricks for the same reason. There's another picture of the Snake Hollow from 1920. This picture actually is in the Library of Congress. I was surprised to find it. And this is one of the vent pipes that you can find in Versailles. Okay? And the last picture I'll show you is this one. This is a picture of a well in Oakmont in 1930. And there were a number of wells in Verona and Oakmont also. There was not only in the Keys, the sales of the Carnegie and so on. This is a map finally of the gas wells throughout the western Pennsylvania in 1970, when there were still thousands and thousands of them. Okay, so let me just conclude this. I don't think I have anything that's dangerous. Okay, so let me just conclude. So my talk is focused primarily on the Pittsburgh region's first natural gas boom, especially in the eastern neighborhoods of Pittsburgh plus the Murraysville area. And I think that there are a number of analogies that can be drawn between the current Marcellus Shale natural gas boom and this earlier period of development, as I said. And these analogies relate to several themes, one of which, for instance, is the question of how long is the supply going to last? What kind of predictions can we make about that? And how much money should we invest because of that? Then another analogy is requirement for new policy, just like we had the Natural Gas Act of 1885 passed to cope with the new situation. Act 13, of course, was passed to cope with the new issues that came up with the fracking. And of course, we're going to get further legislation too. And when we have with the new governor, we may get an extraction tax that they talk about. And of course, there are questions, of course, about investment in the field, who's investing, and particularly, I think, there are major issues about environmental impacts. I've looked at a number of these environmental impacts. Many of them are very similar to what's going on today. So the issue, it seems to me, that we have to face, the most important issue, is what kind of legacy are we going to leave as a result of the current fracking boom, the Marcellus shale boom, maybe Utica after? What kind of legacy to the future? Aside from the fact that we produce a lot of gas, it's going to be used, and so on and so on, but what is the legacy in terms of its impacts on the earth and the water and the air in the future? So let me stop there, and see if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. Thank you. Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, June Marshall. I live in
Okay.
Squirrel.
You have to tell me if you're an engineer or a gas specialist. Prepared to try to.
A graphic designer, know nothing about engineering. The areas that were developed from 1885 to say 1920 for natural
That's
gas.
the period I've looked at. Let's see if that's
Okay. Are they especially liable to be fracked now? I mean,
it.
does
Nobody's
that?
gonna frack in Point Breeze, so it's Squirrel Hill. It's forbidden in the city, actually. No, I don't think so. And don't forget, the shale deposits are quite different in terms of where the gas is acquired as compared with the conventional wells that were done. You know, so I don't think that's so. But it's shale throughout the world, you know. It's all over the place.
So-
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so an area that had been developed for natural gas outside the city, is that an indicator that it's, there's
Maybe we do
potentially
know
gas to be
in
fracked?
Greene County, for instance, which I've looked at, where there were many conventional natural gas wells done, they've also doing a lot of fracking. So that it happens. Yeah, it certainly does happen. Westmoreland County also, I think it's true. And now other places, western Pennsylvania. Yeah. We looked pretty intensely at one particular location in Greene County, and because we were trying to do something for the Marcellus Shale Roundtable, and with the pooling and and I don't want to get into that. But we were surprised to find how many conventional natural gas wells there were in this area where the fracking was being developed. Yeah.
Other question?
Yeah. I don't, whoever, you go ahead.
Toby Chapman, retired chemist,
Quiet chemist?
retired.
Scientist, okay.
The
Quiet
personal
and-
frivolity, I remember many years ago, hearing they had what they called the blooper records, you know, funny things that were
Sure.
said on radio, and one of them was a Groucho Marx program, one of his quiz shows, and a woman there makes the announcement that 95% of the people in Pittsburgh have gas. So, now, it's Selena, but that could have been that big intersection down near where Big Jim's is.
I know.
Okay, because you got
possibly.
8th Avenue coming
It was
in.
about, they said it was about 600 yards above the Elber line at Boat Works, which is no longer there, right, of course. But it can be located, I'm sure one can locate it exactly. But it's down in that general area, you're right.
And also, you mentioned, you know, people smelling natural gas.
No,
Natural
that's
gas
not-
itself.
Right, they don't, but they, well, that's right, you're right. of course. There's no
Okay, so they
smoke.
had to, someone had the idea of putting,
Right. Westinghouse.
T-fuel gas.
Westinghouse,
Is that
of course.
Westinghouse?
Yeah, no, you're entirely right. But they would hear a leak. They would know there was something, the gas was escaping somewhere. That's why you're entirely right, but they couldn't smell it. Manufactured gas, of course, on the other hand,
Yeah.
pretty problematic in that regard. Yeah, thank you. pointing that out.
Anita?
Westinghouse's electric company began around the turn of the 19th century.
Sure.
Did he use the two together in some way?
Well, he did a lot. He had the Philadelphia company provided for natural gas, for electricity, electrical generation, for streetcars. So he did, you know, there were relationships, corporate relationships. So I've gone through some of the annual reports of the Philadelphia company for the early period of time there. And he talks a lot about natural gas, but Duquesne Light came under his control also. You know, so they realized that at the beginning there were many small companies, and Westinghouse acquired many of these, both in the electrical realm and also in natural gas.
Your questioner worked at Westinghouse, by the way. Helen?
Joel, where did the water come from? You said the wells flooded out a lot.
Yeah, well, basically, there is about between 1,500 and 3,000 feet down, it's a whole strata of salt water. Remember that this area had been, a long time ago, of course, we may be there in the future again, but that we were a sea, of course. And there was, so there's, this water had been captured millions of years ago. It was under pressure in many cases, and once it's like there's a release valve when they stick the drill down there, and the water would come up also with the gas. And so one of the major issues I had was how to keep water out of the casing, you know, so the gas could come up without the water mixing in, and they had a lot of problems in that regard. So you can find many articles in the professional literature about how to prevent salt water from intruding on into your well, or particular problems with what they call brine. Brine is a big problem today, of course, also, and the same problem existed in the past. So I don't know if that's, the geologist might give you a much better answer than I could, but that's about what I understand about it. Okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. My name is Josh. I'm a designer, not an engineer.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, my name is Josh. I'm a designer, not an engineer. My question is, what were the environmental concerns in the 1890s relative to what we know today?
I thought you might answer that question. Let me read you a little bit more, okay? What I did was take the environmental issues that we're facing today, recently, and see how many of them existed in the past. So certainly one of them, for instance, I talked about already, was a relationship between air quality from the gas. So that was not a negative impact, but a positive one. But in addition to that, the problems that existed in regard to water pollution were very great. You can find a number of reports, not a number, some court cases and some reports from the public health, State Department of Public Health, about water from the wells, brine from the wells intruding upon the water supply of different communities, like Clarion, for instance, in that area. And some of the cases are very interesting. Or I found cases also where they talked about brine from a natural gas well intercepting and infecting the water wells of people that lived in the neighborhood. Now, you realize that today, most of the cases involving water pollution by Marcellus Shale involve rural areas, and people's well supplies being affected, and streams being affected. The same things existed in the past. Another very interesting similarity is a question of the interaction between natural gas drilling and coal mine tunnels. As early as today they're very worried about that today because they keep on encountering old wells that they didn't know were there, and so on. So in 1950, the Bureau of Mines held a conference in Pittsburgh, And a number of papers were delivered about the problems of the interaction between natural gas drilling and coal mines, and all the explosions were occurring because of the methane that would seep into the mines. So that's a good example of the kind of things that they worried about, and that we worry about too today.
Was there anything done relative to Pittsburgh's water system as a result of the drilling?
No, I don't know Pittsburgh. I never saw anything that said the Pittsburgh water system was affected. And it wouldn't be. Don't forget, Pittsburgh water came from the Allegheny River and on the north bank of the Allegheny, so there was no, to my knowledge, there were no natural gas wells here. So that, I never saw, but it doesn't mean it didn't exist. But there are no court cases, you know, at all. And that's one of the ways I was able to find out information is through court cases. Now, it's a huge amount of oil and gas cases that exist. And many of these are on the web. You can get them on the web. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Paul, I'm a computer person. I get the picture that the gas wells were being drilled in large number in 1870s, 80s, 90s.
Not so much in the 70s,
Okay.
more in the 80s and
Okay.
after.
And then they peaked when, and did new drilling, you know,
They
peter
kept
out
on
at a
acquiring
certain-
more land and drilling more land and so on.
So when did it peak and when did it peter out?
In terms of drilling,
Yeah. And,
I can't answer that exactly. There was still drilling very much after the Second World War. In the early 1980s, there were some serious questions that were discussed in the Pennsylvania legislature about the problems created by natural gas drilling and pollution. There was discussion of legislation, and there was legislation passed in 1984 as a matter of fact as a result of that. There's something interesting. The only report I could find wasn't a published report. It was a mimeographed report that I was lucky enough to find that discussed some of the pollution problems in the early 1980s because of the drilling. So it continues because we're always seeking new sources, of course.
One last question.
I have a question, but I don't want to steal someone else's.
Go ahead.
I mean, obviously, you know, we drive around the neighborhood, we don't see any more oil derricks. Was there any kind
Have
of
you seen the gas derrick up here?
Yeah.
On the corner of Shady and Forbes?
So, I mean, was there any kind of aesthetic consideration in terms of removing?
Yeah, look at the splendid sight of fire in the air.
Yeah.
I showed you that picture, of course, Public Weekly. It's dramatic. It's very dramatic. You know, so like they used to say, people used to tell people, long-time residents here, they say, well, on Saturday night we used to go out on dates to watch them quenching the Coke, the red hot Coke, in the byproduct Coke ovens, right? It was the fire and the fumes. So it's just some of the similar kind of thing.
But there's nothing passed that said that they had to be taken out of the city because people don't want to look at them?
No, I've never found anything like that. In fact, it's amazing. There's some legislation, 1881, it's a very interesting act in the state level about pollution, of water pollution. And that indicates there must have been a fair amount of it to get for them to pass a law. There's no legislation until 1921, and then it's you know, it tries to regulate things, but it's not serious. And the thing, in many cases, just like today, is the absence of a regulatory mechanism or of an adequately staffed regulatory mechanism to take care of the problems.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like to learn more, in the website, Al Mann, who's here, who's chairman of the Liberty Valley Historical Society, did a program for us on the oil pioneers. You can find it in the website and see it. We also have a program on the geology and history and techniques of Marcellus Shale. After we record this talk, you'll find it all as an oil and gas section of the website. Please think about being a member. Please help us. We have a tradition here of cooperative folding of the chairs and taking it over there. I'm not going to be here in January and February. We're taking some time in the South. Helen Wilson will be running the meetings. I want to wish everyone a very good holiday season, and we'll see you in the spring. But please come to the January and February meetings and note all the connections we have. I just mentioned oil. What did we hear about tonight? 9 Mile Run. Going to have a whole lecture in January on the entire scope of 9 Mile Run and the issues there. So the more we do this, the more our programs start interlocking. Thank you for coming.